I would argue that there are very few years in rock and roll history that can compete with 1994 in regards to the quality and the sheer quantity of groundbreaking albums that came out. We will discuss the albums that defined 1994 on this episode of Talking About Records. My name is G.I. Sanders from NTX Vinyl, a small chain of independent record shops in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. If you're not local, but you are in the U.S., you can shop online at ntxvinyl.com, and would love it if you'd subscribe to our channel here on YouTube and follow us across social media. At NTX Vinyl is the handle on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. Let's talk about 1994. I think, first of all, you have to set the context in regards to myself personally and where I'm coming from. In 1994, I was 16 years old. That's a big year when you're a kid, right? Because obviously you get your driver's license. And back then, getting your driver's license was a huge deal. Maybe not so much these days. I don't know. I've heard different opinions on that, whether or not kids actually want to hop behind the wheel. But when you're 16, you get your first car. You're able to cruise around with your friends. You're able to, at that time, grab CDs, take them on the go, and your Discman, plug them into the cassette adapter, which is exactly what I used to do. And I remember this year just being huge. I was, I guess, a sophomore in high school, and it was hard to keep up. I'll be honest with you. I was huge into music already. By the time I was 13, 14 is when I really started getting into it. So by the time you hit 94 and 16, I'm highly anticipating almost all of these albums. There are very few of them that kind of came out of nowhere. There's a couple, but from bands like Pantera to Weezer to Stone Temple Pilots to Nirvana to Tom Petty, it runs across the board. Some of these albums are many of my favorites of all time, much less from the specific year of 94. But I'm going to break down just the top 20 I have in my collection right now. All right, the first one on the list, I figured we'd do this chronologically because I started to kind of compile these and I wasn't sure which order to put them in, if I should put them in my favorites, which was going to be impossible. I thought chronologically would be cool because then you can see kind of throughout the year how it progressed and how many amazing albums actually came out. So first and foremost, January 25th of 1994, the first on the list is actually not an album at all. It's an EP. And at the time, maybe it still is the case, I'd have to look it up. At the time, it was the best-selling EP of all time. And this is Alice in Chains' Jar of Flies. Also comes with the EP Sap. So it was a double release. And I remember it vividly. I remember not buying the album, which I got years after. But I remember buying the CD. I bought it at a Target. And it was groundbreaking for a number of reasons. One, because this was the follow-up to Dirt. And if you know Dirt, it is a heavy album, lyrically, musically, across the board. So the fact that Alice in Chains broke it down with Jar of Flies, which was primarily an acoustic-based sound, and then they paired it with Sap, which I think I had heard Sap because, again, the band had been around with Facelift, and then Sap, and then Dirt prior to getting to Jar of Flies, but it was really cool that they paired them together for the vinyl release. The CD was on its own. I think they maybe released a dual CD as well, but just an incredible record. If I think about songs like I Stay Away, No Excuses, Don't Follow, there are just some beautiful tracks on Jar of Flies, as well as Sap. Sap came out, again, years earlier. But in 94, when Jar of Flies was released, it was very surprising to me, and I think surprising to a lot of people who had just discovered Alice in Chains via the heaviness of Dirt, then to introduce a completely acoustic-based record. It just showed how diverse the band was and how creative they were, and it cemented Alice in Chains for me as one of my favorite bands at that time. Going into Jar of Flies, I had been back through Dirt, and Facelift and love the heaviness, but to bring this element of acoustic based music was just such a cool thing. And then of course they doubled down on it when they recorded Unplugged and featured almost all of these tracks, as well as some of their heavier songs stripped down. And it again just shows the diversity and the skill that this band had. And so absolutely love it. And again, January 25th to kick off the year was a great start for 94. All right, just a week later, on February 1st, 1994, Dookie by Green Day was released. Now, this is an interesting one for me. I was not a big punk rock kid. Like, of course, I knew the Ramones, the Clash, the Sex Pistols, kind of like the bigger hits. But being 16, obviously that predated me. So I knew about punk, but I didn't necessarily, really get into it until years later. Green Day hits, and, to me, this was punk. Now, looking back on it, it's more of a pop punk thing. I get that, but the hooks are what really, really grabbed you in 1994, because songs like When I Come Around, Longview, Basket Case, Welcome to Paradise, they were staples on alternative rock radio in 94. I don't own a ton of Green Day records. I own Kerplunk, which I believe predated this one. They may have had some earlier like EPs and stuff. So I think Dookie's their second full-length release, certainly when they broke on to the scene from a mainstream perspective. And then you had, they followed this with the Woodstock performance, which was very iconic and memorable for a kid like me to be able to see that. But a great album. It definitely takes me back to 94, again, driving around in my car, like I mentioned, because this was all over radio. It was impossible to avoid. And I think it does really stand up really well and has aged well, despite it being, kind of a dated record to 94 in that period. But it's a fantastic listen, front to back, if you're into Green Day, a band that has changed a lot over the years and kind of morphed their sound. But going back to their early roots of the early 90s, this is a great album that I highly recommend. And I think a lot of people know them for this album, even though they've gone on to do stuff like American Idiot, which was hugely popular and almost a completely different genre in a lot of ways. But I love the early stuff. I love Dookie. It was definitely in high rotation for me in 94. A month later, on March 1st, 94, we got introduced, or at least I got introduced, to the greatness of Beck. This is Mellow Gold, and of course, the song Loser is what you know this album for. It's what everybody knew Beck for at this time. He had a couple releases before this, but none that got the exposure and the mainstream attention like Mellow Gold. MTV was a huge player in this. The video was massive. Back then, bands were broke on radio and MTV from a mainstream perspective. Like, that's just how it worked. If you weren't seeing them in the clubs, again, being a 16-year-old kid, I could only get to so many shows. So radio was huge and Loser was huge, but Pay No Mind is a great track. Fucking With My Head, Soul Sucking Jerk, Beer Can, Nightmare Hippie Girl. It's a weird juxtaposition between folk and experimental indie rock is the only way I can explain this. And it's hard to put your finger on this album, but I could say that just about any Beck album, because he morphs in between so many different genres. This honestly isn't even in my top 3 or maybe even top 5 of favorite Beck albums, but I do love it because of the nostalgia aspect, because it's the first time I heard Beck. And when you're introduced to an artist, that moment always sticks with you. And it was impossible in 1994 not to run across Beck, because Loser was everywhere. This album was huge. And it was I think in a lot of ways, the start to his career, even though he had a couple records before this. But this is what really kicked it off. And then he follows this up, with albums like Odelay and Sea Change and Midnight Vultures. There's just so many great records in his catalog. So I love Beck, and I don't know if I'd say I even love this album in his discography, but it's a great record, and it does go a lot deeper than just Loser. Unfortunately, it has not remained in print, which is very strange given that it's you know, one of his best-selling records simply because of that song. One of his most well-known for sure. It's a shame that they haven't kept it in print, but hopefully that'll change and they'll do a repress on this one at some point. So check out Mellow Gold if you're not familiar. Again, this was March 1st of '94. Just a week later, 2 albums dropped on March 8th, 1994. I'll take them one at a time. The first is from the greatness of Soundgarden and Super Unknown. I've talked about this album extensively over the course of many videos and had many discussions around it. It's one of my favorite albums of all time. I think it's one of the greatest albums ever written and produced and recorded. This is an original pressing on orange vinyl that came on blue, orange, and clear. Thankfully, it is still in print as far as the reissues are concerned, so you can get this album. It's a landmark to me. It is. It's the physical graffiti of the early '90s, from my perspective, because of the depth this album has. You know it for songs like Black Hole Sun and Spoon Man. I know it for songs like Suicide and The Day I Tried to Live and 4th of July. It's just a fantastic record. The entire band gelled, I think, in a way on this album that they never did prior, and they never replicated after, which is, again, it's hard to live up to such an iconic album like Super Unknown. I saw the band on this tour when they came through Dallas. It was a fantastic show. It was good to see them during this era, because as you got past this and of course into Down the Upside, I saw them on that tour as well, but then they started to kind of implode a little bit. So it was great to catch the band when they were firing on all cylinders, and I can't really preface how big of a player this was in '94 for me. Loved Bad Motorfinger. I loved Louder Than Love. Bad Motorfinger was huge, and then for them to drop this album, it just tells you how good '94 was of a year, that you can have this record and the next one drop on the same day. March 8th, you had Super Unknown. You also had The Downward Spiral by 9 Inch Nails. I remember the day I bought this record right here. This is a promotional copy that was released in '94. I walked into a really small record store here locally in the Dallas area. It was a short-lived store. I think I was only there once or twice, but the first time I walked in, it was, I don't think I got it like on release day. I believe it was within a couple weeks of the release though. I had already bought the CD and was immersed in that. Back in those times, when you're a 16-year-old kid, you only have so much money. So a lot of my money was going to CDs just because they were portable and I could take them into the car to listen to, right? But when there were albums that really spoke to me and I just knew, like, man, this is something special, a lot of times I would try to save up enough money to buy the record. In this case, I did. I distinctly remember my mom was in Target and I went to the record store, which was just a couple doors down. I walked into this kind of odd record store. It was kind of bare and there wasn't a lot of inventory. It was a small place and just a few things to look at. And the guy had this playing on the turntable. And of course I knew it because I had just bought the CD. It had just been out and I thought it was cool. I'm like, man, this is a great record store. They're playing the Nine Inch Nails, so definitely the place for me. And as I started to kind of exit the store and had a quick conversation with the guy, realized that he was spinning a vinyl copy of it versus just the CD, and that's what sparked the conversation. And that's when he showed me that this was a promo copy and he just had a couple of them, and that's when I convinced my mom to loan me the $20 to grab it. Just a groundbreaking record. Again, I knew Pretty Hate Machine, everyone did, because it had like a hole and down in it. Then you had Broken, which also was an amazing release from an EP perspective. But I don't think anyone expected The Downward Spiral to be what it was. So dark and so layered, and just full of so much angst and energy. I remember seeing the video for March of the Pigs, which predated the release. Closer was a later single, and that was a great video as well. But seeing that March of the Pigs video, which was all white and they're in fishnets and just banging into each other and smashing their keyboards and stuff. I'd never seen anything like it. Like, I know Trent was not the one to invent this kind of industrial alternative metal that he was writing and recording, but he was certainly on the forefront of bringing it to the mainstream. And in '94, it's amazing that something like this could be mainstream. That's what makes the year so beautiful and makes my youth so beautiful. And I was 16 years old. The fact that an album like this could get so much attention. I mentioned March of the Pigs, Closer, the big singles. I love songs like The Becoming, the deep tracks on this, Big Man with a Gun, Reptile, and then it closes off with Hurt, obviously. Very, very quiet song, which Johnny Cash went on to remake and kind of create the definitive version, if you will. But saw the band on this tour, I think twice on the Downward Spiral tour. They liked coming through Dallas. So between 93 and 95, they came through Dallas a couple times. So I caught them on this tour, very thankfully, and it was a spectacle. Marilyn Manson opened on at least one of the shows. I think maybe the Melvins were on the other one. I could be wrong about that, but incredible album, beautifully dark, and again, March 8th to get Super Unknown and the Downward Spiral, that just shows you how incredible of a year '94 was. Next on the list, March 22nd of '94. This is an album that at the time really, really made an impact, especially here in Dallas. This is Far Beyond Driven by Pantera. I knew Pantera as far as the name is concerned, but I'm not a huge underground metal guy, so I wasn't into the 80s Pantera. I was too young, really. But by the time '94 rolls around, this drops on MTV and drops on radio, which here in town was 97.1 The Eagle, or Z-Rock to a certain extent had just ended, but I think the Eagle took over the heavy stuff. And this was an eye-opener, because I'll go through most of this list, and I would say, along with the Downward Spiral, which we just talked about, Far Beyond Driven is absolutely the heaviest record on this list that I own. There were some heavy records that came out that year in general. This is a cool reissue, which is in print. Planet Caravan, I remember that song specifically, and of course I remember I'm Broken. That was the big single. I don't own a ton of Pantera records. This is one of my favorites, probably my favorite, along with Cowboys from Hell. But again, being a Dallas-based band and seeing this on MTV and hearing this on the radio, it was a game changer for my mind, knowing what was possible from a metal perspective. You had bands like Metallica and Slayer and kind of the huge internationally known bands, but for a local band from Dallas to be getting the same street cred and to be getting played right next to those kind of contemporaries was really, really cool. And it's an album and a band that I cherish, just because, again, the local ties are huge, and I think they have a great history and a ton of great records. This one being at the top of the list for me personally. Fast forwarding to April 12th, '94. This, you want to talk about MTV. This is Rollins' band, Wait. I actually got a signed pass when I saw him recently. I forgot that was in there. This is a press on red vinyl. And the reason why this album specifically was on my radar, as well as on the radar of a lot of kids in 1994, was because of the song Liar, and specifically because of the video for Liar, and even more specifically because of how that video was introduced on the show Beavis and Butthead, which is a hilarious classic show, animated show by Mike Judge. But when this came out, I knew the name Henry Rollins. I knew kind of Black Flag. Again, I was 16 in '94, so all of that kind of early garage, heavy punk influenced stuff, was before my time. And so something like this comes out, and it's the entry point for me to go back and go, well, Henry Rollins, I knew that name, and he was in Black Flag. And then you start discovering the spider web of all of the bands and the musicians that created that scene. This is, I think, still a very underrated record as it pertains to not only 94, but just the early 90s kind of alternative period in general. Really strong effort. I like a lot of Rollins band stuff, but this one takes the cake for me, other than Liar, the big single, Disconnect, Civilized, Wrong Man, Divine Object of Hatred. Just a great record through and through. Not one that you hear talked about because other than the big single, it didn't get a ton of play. I'm sure he sold plenty of records off that, off the single alone. And this is another one, unfortunately, that's just been out of print for a while. It's very hard to get, which is very frustrating, especially for Henry Rollins because he's such a big vinyl nerd. And has done a lot to make sure that his stuff is accessible, as far as like the earlier kind of the SST Black Flag stuff. But getting into the Rollins band era, there are a number of LPs, this one being included in that list, which are just out of print and very hard to get. So I'm hoping he gets his hands around this catalog at some point and does it justice, because it sure would be cool to get remastered versions of these, repressed, just back in print versions, because I know a lot of people love this record and a lot of this era, and it's just really hard to find. So check out Wait. There's so much more to this album besides Liar. If that's the only one you know, I encourage you to give it a listen. Also released on April 12th, 1994 is the sophomore record from Courtney Love and her band Hole. You can't not mention that a week before, Kurt Cobain was found dead, which is obviously a tentpole moment in 1994. There's kind of pre-Cobain's death and post. This being a very awkward release that came out a week later. So I think it is tied so specifically to his death that it's hard to kind of separate those two. You can imagine when you've got a record scheduled to come out, highly anticipated because she was Kurt's wife, obviously, and then he passes away and your album comes out a week later. And that's got to be an incredibly tough situation to be in because, it was her career as well. She was a musician. Their first record, Pretty on the Inside, was an indie release, more or less. So this was going to be a huge album for the band and for her personally. And to have it drop at a time like that had to be incredibly difficult. I can imagine what that was like. I do love the record. I like this one. I also like Celebrity Skin. I didn't go much beyond that as far as their catalog is concerned. I know there's a couple other releases in there, but Violet, Miss World, single was Doll Parts. On the backside, Credit in the Straight World is a great song. It's just it's a great kind of, alt-rock, grunge era record, female fronted, which is cool because there weren't a ton of those, at least not breaking into the mainstream. You had L7 and had a couple of others, but Hole was obviously kind of in the forefront of that because of her relationship with Kurt. But I think it's a great album. I think she gets a bad rap. I don't know how much of this record she wrote versus Kurt versus Billy Corgan. There's all these rumors about, maybe she didn't write a lot of these songs. I don't know, but she sure as hell performed the hell out of them. Great album, pretty underrated, and I think a lot of that is just time and place in regards to when it came out. But if you're not familiar with Live Through This, it's definitely a key listen for this time period from 94. Later in April, on the 26th, an album drops. And I can assure you, I did not know this band at the time. This was brand new to me when Throwing Copper by Live comes out. And I remember the first single, I believe, was I Alone, and had a really, again, eye-catching video on MTV, which was where so much of this was discovered by me and so many other people. I had not heard of the band Live. I didn't know their prior. I think they just had one, maybe two records before this. Mental Jewelry. There was maybe one other. But this is a great album. Luckily, it is still in print. They've reissued it a number of times over the years. This is the 25th anniversary. Great record, great band. Going through a lot of turmoil in recent years because they are, or at least were, still together and active. But I think it's a great representation of the music at the time. The song Lightning Crashes was huge. All Over You, I think, was a single as well, in addition to I Alone. This was a big one. I mean, this band was huge. You just forget. You go down this list, and there's bands like Soundgarden and Nine Inch Nails and Green Day and Alice in Chains. And Live isn't a band that a lot of people put up there when they talk about some of those more iconic early to mid 90s bands. But this album was as big as any of them. And again, so much of that was due to MTV and radio play. But they toured, for years on this record and followed it up with a couple of good records as well. So pretty underrated. But I know there's a big fan base for this album because I sell a ton of it. I can assure you of that. Anytime it comes back in stock, it flies off the shelves, which I love because, again, for me being a 16-year-old kid getting exposed to this, and now so many years later, knowing that I was not alone because there's still so many people gravitating towards kind of a niche album like this is still cool to see. So Throwing Copper by Live, again, this is April 26th of 94, a great album to check out. Just a couple weeks later on May 10th of 94, another band that I had not heard of at all, and that's because it was their debut. In fact, it's one of the only albums, there's only a couple on here of debut albums that had no pre-existing release, and that is the Blue Album by Weezer. This one was big. I'll say it again, huge on MTV. The Sweater Song and Buddy Holly, those videos were great. I saw the band on this tour. It was one of the first times I went to kind of a national club show. It's a very iconic venue here in Dallas called Trees, which is still there to this day. And the band was playing that night. I've actually got an insert because I went to Bill's Records in Dallas, which was a iconic record store, and met the band and got them to sign the flat. I didn't have the record at that time. I think I only had the CD. This is just a reissue of the Blue Album. But it's a fantastic album. I don't know if I'd say it's in the pop punk genre. It's just a great rock record. I mentioned the singles, Buddy Holly and the Sweater Song, but My Name is Jonas, Surf Wax America, Say It Ain't So, In the Garage, Only in Dreams. It's the greatest hits. I mean, every song on this record is fantastic. I am not a huge Weezer fan. I think they're this record as well as Pinkerton and the kind of the Green Album, and then it tails off for me. I just didn't stay with them for whatever reason. I've heard some of the other stuff over the years, and I know there's huge fans of this band. But for me, this record specifically, and those first couple are really the key. This was the first show. In fact, this was the only show at Trees in Dallas when I saw it. It was about a 500-person club that I crowd surfed at. I do vividly remember that. It's a packed club, all sweaty, and just getting thrown up on top of people, and there's Doc Martens everywhere. It's completely ridiculous, but for me, it was the one and only time I did that, so I have that memory. And I remember being at that show, and they only had this album out, so it was not like a long show. You got an hour and a half if you were lucky, but it was packed. It was sold out. The band was blowing up on MTV, and they had no business playing a venue that small, so it was very cool to see them at that time. I'd have to look up the date on the show, but I know it was in 94. So Weezer, Blue Album, goes without saying, iconic 94 record. Later in the month, on May 31st, the greatness of Ill Communication drops. So Beastie Boys obviously had been around for a while prior to this album. It's a great story how they got discovered and how they really developed as a band. And learned how to play instruments. So unique because they were just MCs. They were just up there, dropping beats and rhymes on their first couple records. And so by the time Ill Communication comes around, like they're known for, Brass Monkey and Girls and Fight for Your Right to Party, which again, staples on, mid to late 80s MTV into the early 90s. And then this album comes along. And you hear Sabotage, and you see the video for Sabotage. It's like a completely different band. I had no idea, and I don't think anybody did, that the Beastie Boys had it in them. But just a game changer. Like I as far as my expectations of what they could do, what a hip hop band could do, and really what any band could do at that time. There were no boundaries. You could be a hip hop band and you could write a rock record for the most part and get it played on the radio and break through and then go on to headline tours. I saw them on Lollapalooza '95 with Smashing Pumpkins, where they were kind of co-headlining. It was an unbelievable tour. So I just cherish this record. It is far and away my favorite Beastie Boys record. I only own a couple of them, but it's just great record through and through. I love Sabotage to this day. Sure Shot is another great song on this record. Just a really well-rounded record that hits hard and takes some of that early vibe they have and combines it with what was going on in '94, which was guitar-driven rock. And so kudos to them for getting in the studio and really perfecting their craft on real instruments, which is something they hadn't done a lot of prior to this. June 7th, 1994. This is an album that was highly anticipated, not only by myself, but a lot of people, and that is because this is the sophomore album from Stone Temple Pilots. Their initial release, Core, was huge. Came out in '92, and they got a lot of flack because they weren't from Seattle. They were from San Diego, and they had their own thing going. By the time they got around to Purple, I loved that their sound had progressed. This is an original pressing that I bought back in the day on Purple vinyl, which is really, really beautiful. I love this record. I love the album tracks on this shine as much as the singles. You had big singles. Interstate Love Song was huge. Vaseline, I think, was the first single. But Meat Plow, I absolutely love. Lounge Fly, Big Empty was big. That was on the Crows soundtrack. So that's the first you heard of Stone Temple Pilots post-Core. Was getting to hear that. You didn't know it was going to be on their album because at that time it was all surprise when things came out. But Unglued, Army Ants, it's just a great record. It showed a lot of maturity, I think, from the band, because that first record was I love Core, but other than Creep, I think it was pretty much straight down the middle, just heavy hitting guitar rock, which I love. Nothing wrong with that. But then they started to expand and they started to get into some different textures, some different guitar tones. Certainly the songwriting developed a lot. So this is the perfect, I think, mix between their first album, Core, and their third album, which I'm blanking on the name of. Tiny Music. Why am I blanking on Tiny Music? So you had Core and you had Tiny Music, and this Purple was right in the middle, and it's the perfect blend of those two to me, because by the time they got to Tiny Music, they were doing more of almost a Bowie thing. They got into, a more indie type, psychedelic Bowie type trip, which I love. And then you had Core, which is really heavy, but this one right in the middle really hits the sweet spot for me. If you're going to ask me a Stone Temple Pilots record to start with, this is the one that I would recommend. It is a songwriting masterpiece by the DeLeo brothers, and I think Scott Weiland did an excellent job on bringing some energy to the table. Great record. Love Purple. Played it a ton when it came out and still play it to this day. Skip ahead to the end of the summer in '94, August 23rd. This is an album, debut record, soul release, honestly, kind of stands alone in this list. Grace by Jeff Buckley. I've talked about this album a lot, and I feel like it deserves to get a lot of attention. It didn't at the time, honestly. Like, I remember hearing of it, but I don't think I heard this record till years later, honestly. It took me a while. I think it was probably till after he passed away when I heard the name Jeff Buckley and heard of him, and then kind of went back to this album. Produced by the great Andy Wallace. It's a beautiful record that features one of the greatest voices of the early to mid '90s. If you don't know the story, he passed away swimming in the Mississippi River tragically. Songs like Last Goodbye and Mojo Pen, So Real. It's most famous for his cover of Hallelujah by Leonard Cohen. That's probably the song most people know. But go check out Eternal Life if you want to hear the different side of Jeff Buckley. Some heavy stuff. There's a live show DVD of him at the Metro in Chicago performing this with his band. That is absolutely incredible. So I've watched that a ton of times over the years. But it just shows you how good 94 was, that a band like an album like this can drop and go virtually undiscovered in the mainstream. Like, it didn't have, again, not a big radio hit type of album by any means. But I think of all of these albums, this one has aged as well as any of them. It's a beautiful record. The songwriting, the instrumentation, and the voice are absolutely just beautiful. And I love this album. So definitely check out Grace if you're not familiar. It's probably one of the least known records, if not the least known record on this list, which is an absolute shame. But again, just speaks to how good the year was. So check out Grace. Released the same day as Grace on August 23rd. This was highly anticipated, especially if you lived in the Dallas area, because this is Rubberneck by the Toadies. As you can see, this is a signed copy, which is a really cool artifact that I have. Also produced by the great Andy Wallace, mixed by Andy Wallace, produced by Rob Schnapp and Tom Rothrock. This first full-length release, the band had some cassette kind of EPs and a CD EP come out prior to this. They are technically from Fort Worth, Texas, but this is a metroplex, so Dallas, Fort Worth, Denton is all in one. And so these guys were playing a ton already by the time this came out, and it was highly anticipated. Everyone knows it for Possum Kingdom. That was the big song. I Come From the Water is amazing. Tyler, Velvet, I Burn, Backslider, Mr. Love. I just basically named the whole track list. So it is an album that really holds up well, and to this day sounds fantastic. And again, being from Dallas, kind of like what I was saying with Pantera, this one just holds a special place. The band is still around to this day. They're super good dudes. They're a hard-working band that has, gone through a lot, honestly, because the follow-up to this album took years and really killed their momentum, because they were poised to be a huge band. This album sold a ton of records and got a ton of play and put them on tours all across the world. And then unfortunately, a lot of that momentum got killed. Their follow-up, which was Hell Below, Stars Above, which is a fantastic record, has never been released on vinyl, unfortunately. Hopefully it's coming. But go back to Toadies and Rubberneck. It's got a funny cover. A lot of people always slack it for the cover. But it is a great rock record. I would challenge you to find a better heavy-hitting, straightforward rock record from the early 90s. I think this stands up with just about all of them, and including the majority of these on this list. It's that good. Go check it out. A month later, on September 27th, we got to hear Monster by REM. REM was a huge band coming into the early 90s. They had obviously a huge history, being one of the first kind of college indie bands to break out of Atlanta, and they were already getting lots of airplay for their earlier records prior to this, especially Automatic for the People, which predated this, which was a massive hit. But this is a unique album in REM's catalog. Again, coming out of '94 against all of the heaviness that was going on in rock during that time, they kind of went that direction and wanted to match it. What's the Frequency, Kenneth was the first single. Bang and Blang, Crush with Eyeliner, all really fantastic songs. It's one of my favorite REM records, probably in the top 3, I would say. It's a really unique, and you just didn't get a lot of straightforward kind of guitar rock out of the band other than this record. It shows up in spots on a lot of other releases, but again, this is being released in '94 amongst all these other heavy hitters. This one really sticks out. Produced by Scott Litt and the band. It's an album that I think has aged really well. Back in the day, because of all these other releases, I don't think I listened to it quite as much, and didn't own it early on. But I've caught up a lot on REM over the years, and this is one that I really do cherish. So if you're not familiar with Monster, definitely worth a listen, and definitely, again, one that has aged very well, in my opinion. So in April of 94, like I mentioned, we lost Kurt Cobain. And then in November of 94, we finally got the actual unplugged release, released on November 1st of 1994. This is not an original pressing, but a kind of an early pressing that's on red vinyl. There's a lot of different pressings of this one, and thankfully it's still readily available and in print if you need a copy of Unplugged. But I remember when Kurt died, sitting there watching MTV News with Kurt Loder just over and over. It was just repeat of the news, and then they would intersperse it with playing the Unplugged performance, which, as you can see, and if you've heard the story, that it was pretty much set up to look like a funeral, and it did. And the way it was presented alongside his death, it made it seem like the kind of the swan song for the band. They went on to play after they performed Unplugged. It wasn't their last performance ever, but it certainly feels like it, and it certainly stands as kind of the end cap to the band, if you will. Incredible performance of songs, like Come As You Are, About a Girl. But like, those aren't the ones that stand out. Like, the ones that stand out are, the covers. Jesus Don't Want Me for a Sunbeam, The Man Who Sold the World, Oh Me, Lake of Fire, closes it with Where Did You Sleep Last Night, a traditional song written by Leadbelly. It's a heartbreaking performance, and it's a record that I think represents the year of 94 because of Cobain's death, and in a lot of ways represents, the end of an era in a lot of ways. I mean, don't get me wrong, so many of these bands continued on. Nirvana obviously didn't. But from 91 to 94, or from 90 to 94, like, that was the period Nirvana existed, more or less. It was very brief. Talk about impactful, and talk about a way to go out as far as a release. Unplugged. I don't know if it's as good as Alice in Chains Unplugged. It's right up there. I would put the two of them as the absolute best, in my opinion, as far as the performance and the set list and what it meant to the band's career. So just an iconic performance that is very sad to listen to this day, but I still can find some enjoyment of it. Aged very well, like a lot of these, and just a beautiful live performance. Also released on November 1st, 94. One of my favorite albums of all time. I could say that about a lot of these records, but Wildflowers by Tom Petty. What an absolute gem, produced by the great Rick Rubin. Everybody knew Tom Petty. He was huge from, the early days of the Heartbreaker self-titled record, through Dan the Torpedoes, all the way through the 80s. And then you get into the early 90s, and again, he's an artist that was trying to find his way, which I think is why he ended up at Rick Rubin's doorstep, trying to kind of reinvent himself a little bit as a songwriter. And man, did he ever do it. This is, I would put it up there as not only Tom Petty's best, but one of the best records out of this whole list, and this is a stacked list. It's got songs that I would rank up there with some of my favorite songs of all time as well. The title track, You Don't Know How It Feels, You Wreck Me, fantastic. The tail end of it, Crawling Back to You, Wake Up Time, Cabin Down Below. Don't forget some rockers like Honeybee, just a beautiful record. I saw Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers on this tour at the amphitheater here in Dallas. I'll never forget that show. It was raining, sitting on the lawn. It's just a fantastic record. Like, what can I say? I've got the big old box set. I think it's like an 8 LP box set of this one with all the outtakes as well, because it's just that good. Everything he was doing at this time was really, really sincere. And unfortunately, we only got half of the record back in 94. It was supposed to be a double release. And so, thankfully his estate has done a great job of curating everything that unreleased that Tom has put out. This is an original pressing from 94 that I got. I think I got it in the late 90s. I don't think I got it right in 94, but I remember getting this late 90s or early 2000s, picked this up just because it's an album I loved. But thankfully it's been reissued. You can get it. There's a 3 LP version, which is the kind of the full vision that he originally wanted to release, more or less. And then again, the box set version with all the unreleased and the live stuff's really good too. So love Wildflowers, and it's just amazing to me that an album like this came out amongst all these others. It just shows you how diverse of a year it was and how incredible the music was. Another album released on November 1st, 1994. It's hard to believe what the release schedules must have looked like back then. This is Amorica by the Black Crowes. Highly anticipated. I loved Shake Your Moneymaker. I really love Southern Harmony. So by the time Amorica drops, just craving more Black Crowes because I was a big fan. This album comes out, obviously the cover being the most shocking part of it. This is an original pressing. They actually have the white vinyl autographed by the band. But songs like Wiser Time, songs like Descending, just timeless songs that to this day move me so much. And I remember back when this came out, hiding the CD cover so my mom wouldn't see it, making sure she didn't get wind of that cover because it would not have flown. But following up Southern Harmony was not going to be an easy feat. I mean, you had huge songs like Thorn in My Pride, and it was not easy, but that's what these bands went through because they had so many good releases. All of these bands, except for the ones where maybe it was their debut, but the bands where it was their second, third, fourth album, like they were all hitting on all cylinders, firing on all cylinders right at this time. And that's what makes 94 so great is you've got just every different type of artist, mostly rock here, other than maybe Beastie Boys, but everything else. As far as albums that define 94, you've got bands that were at the top of their game. And Amorica is the top of the game for the Black Crowes, in my opinion. I love all the other records, pre and post Amorica, but this is the one. If you're a Crow, if you're not a big Crowes fan and you're looking for one to kind of dive into them to understand who they are, this is it. This is the bridge from the early kind of Southern rock influence stuff to the later jam band type of Crowes. This is that middle ground where they split the difference, and so many of these songs are still in their set list to this day because they're that good. So I love Amorica. It's one of my favorite records, and I love the white vinyl original pressing. This one is still in print, so you can pick it up. It just kind of comes and goes, but definitely grab Amorica if you get a chance. And if you're not familiar with it, I really encourage you to check it out. A few weeks later, on November 22nd of 1994, I remember walking into my local record store, I mentioned earlier, Bill's Records, and buying Vitology by Pearl Jam. Now, this was unique because November 22nd, 1994 is when I walked in and bought this record. Nobody else could buy it on CD or cassette until December 6th. So it came out 2 full weeks early on vinyl, which these days wouldn't be that big a deal. Back then, it was a huge deal because nobody had a turntable. I was one of the only kids, if not the only kid in my high school that I knew of that had a turntable and actually listened to records. So when Vitology came out early, of course I jumped on it, and for those 2 weeks, I was the only kid in school, literally, that had the record. Spin the Black Circle was the first single, so that was all over radio, but getting to hear the rest of it prior to everyone else, only in my room, was a fantastic experience, and I remember it vividly. This is an album that it's a hard period for the band. This is the album, if you read up on them, watch Pearl Jam 20 documentary, it's kind of where they almost broke up, coming out of Versus, which was a very hard album for them to write. And they were the biggest band in the world, literally, especially after Kurt passed away. Pearl Jam kind of, whether they liked it or not, had to carry that torch forward in some way, shape, or form. But they didn't want to. Certainly Eddie Vedder didn't want to. He just wanted to be a musician. But at this time, they were massive. And you had huge radio hits on this as well. I mentioned Spin the Black Circle coming out as the first single. But you've got songs like Better Man. You've got songs like Not For You, which was big. They played that on Saturday Night Live. And then you've got really heavy tracks like Whippin' and Satan's Bed. Trimmer Christ, a great album track. So is Immortality, fantastic. I've got a flat similar to that Weezer one that I got when the album was released as well. So great album. I love the fact that Well, I love a lot of things about this record. I love the fact that it didn't say Pearl Jam, just like the vinyl version of Versus didn't. At that point, the band had stopped doing videos. They'd stopped doing press. They were done with the entire mainstream hoopla of grunge, and they put this record out, and they just kept touring. They kept being a band. They went on to No Code, which is even more experimental and more of a departure from that early sound, which is what I loved about it. So kind of this album and No Code are that transition period where the vast majority of people stopped listening to Pearl Jam. And for me, I was like, yes, get the hell out of the way. They're my band. I'm ready to continue down the road with them as they create and morph their sound. And so I didn't need to just hear the tracks from 10 or just hear the singles from Versus. Like Vitology was that transition record between Versus and No Code, where they were, trying to figure out where they were going to go. Eddie Vedder had taken the lead as far as a songwriting perspective was concerned, which was a big change for the band, but it stands the test of time. Vitology is a great record, and I think it's a very important piece in the Pearl Jam story. Last but not least, on December 6th, that same day that Vitology came out on CD, is when 16 Stone by Bush dropped. Their debut record, definitely not a band that I had heard anything about until the single. The singles had dropped. Everything's In, which is the intro track, and was the first single, was really, really big and getting a lot of attention. Other favorites from this, Come Down was a great single. I love that song. Machine Head, Glycerine was a big single as well. Little Things, huge radio band. This was one of the first kind of bigger shows I went to that wasn't like a full-on concert, but it also wasn't like a little club. So it was a venue called the Bomb Factory in Dallas. When they came through, it's still here. It's called the Factory now, and it's changed owners a bunch and names a few times. But saw the band on that tour, and I remember it vividly. They were huge at the time. This is an album that's still in print. It's kind of a different cover. This is a clear vinyl version that they've repressed over the years, thankfully, because it's a great album. And they've gone on to Gavin Rossdale has gone on to do solo work and has kept the band active over the years. I haven't followed the career that much other than this record and I think the second record, which was Razorblade Suitcase. But I still do appreciate this one. It's a little more dated than I think a lot of the other stuff is, just to my ears. When I listen to 16 Stone, I still enjoy it, but it hasn't aged quite as well, at least from my opinion, but still a great record, some great songwriting. And again, one of those, I think, along with Lives, Throwing Copper, Live Through This by Hole, certainly Wait by Rollins Band, that are kind of underrated, because when you've got heavy hitters like Soundgarden, Nine Inch Nails, and Beastie Boys, and REM and Nirvana and Tom Petty on the list, it's hard to squeak in there if you're Bush. But it's a great record. If you're into alternative rock, it's definitely one to check out if you want to go back and discover what 1994 was all about. So there you go, a trip down memory lane to one of the greatest years that rock and roll has ever seen in regards to new releases. It's hard to imagine that all of those, plus so many others that I didn't even get to, were squeezed into 1 year. If I think about it these days, as I look at new release list and the albums that come out every week, like there's usually a couple from bigger named artists that are gonna really get a lot of attention and press and all those types of things. But going back to a list like this, where it was basically every week, or at least a couple weeks out of every month, where there were big releases, and it just shows how much has changed. Again, without radio support, from a mainstream perspective, and without MTV, it's very hard for bands these days to get the type of mainstream exposure that was happening back in '94. So it's just different times, but it is great to look back. It's a bit mind-boggling to see this list and put it in order, and again, knowing all the ones I missed too, and there's a lot of them. So it's a fantastic year for new music, especially in the rock genre. So hope you enjoyed it. My name is G.I. Sanders. This has been Talking About Records as always, and we will see you again next time.